Welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where our first special look ahead to the 2026 Scottish parliamentary election continues. A week ago on the podcast, you heard from the First Minister John Swinney and from the Scottish Labour leader Sarwar. That's still in your feed should you like to listen to it. But we've saved the best till last, because to offer some analysis, to put it all into context, is Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics from Strathclyde University. Welcome. Now, I have to say, this is something we've never really done before on the pod, which is to do a bit of a debrief and a bit of a conversation about what we've just heard from the politicians. So, at any point, if you would like to take part, we're here at Johnny Walker on Princess Street, supported by Diageo, sponsored by the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to Be Measured campaign. If you would like to take part, put up your hand, we'll get a microphone to you, whether it's a question for Geoff, Andy, or John, or it's a comment or a take on what you've heard from John Swinney and Anas Sarwar, they'd be very welcome. John Curtice, first of all then, what did you make of what you heard by way of how Swinney and Sarwar are setting out their direction of travel towards the election next year?
Well, let me say, first of all, let's start off at least being complimentary before we kind of engage in the critical analysis. I think both politicians gave a good presentation of themselves. I think one could feel that irrespective of your political views in Scotland, we are quite lucky to have the choice as First Minister between two individuals who are clearly committed to Scotland, who were clearly committed to the job, and are clearly highly articulate individuals. And I sometimes sat there and, followed. I mean, I don't follow the details of public policy to the same extent as some of you in this room. And I was going, well, gosh, they're really doing well to be able to hang this wide-ranging conversation together. So I think, point one, there is a serious choice there. How do we go beyond that? Well, I think the first point is that both of them, one of the reasons why they both demonstrated their skills as politicians is that one thing, and above all, one hopes that politicians have is some understanding of the mood of the public they're trying to appeal to. And I think the one thing that they both said entirely independently of each other is that they are looking at an electorate which is, well, the words they used is lacking hope, but certainly pessimistic. And certainly, all the boring numbers that I look at, that is the message you get. And it was something that was repeated in the British Social Justice report that came out this morning. We are talking about a public which is, the way I put it is this, is that we've got too many people in our society who basically are not entirely sure that they're going to be able to feed their kids. And who are certainly not sure that if they should fall ill, the NHS will be able to give them treatment in time. And this is not unique to Scotland. It's a problem across the UK. It's a legacy of the pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war, etc. But I think what's also true is that there certainly is a lack of confidence in the ability of the state to turn these things around. Now, of course, the answer that the two questions that the gentleman then gave to this was different. For John Swinney, the answer is it's independence, and I think we should come back to that. For Anas Sarwar, it is almost saying, well, I'm going to promise you a politics of competence. And in that, he's not dissimilar to the pitch of Keir Starmer last year. At the end of the day, one of the criticisms that was made of the Labour campaign last year was that, well, basically, it was one word, change. But change to what? And arguably, one of the reasons why this government why the UK government has struggled since in terms of its political communications is because they hadn't laid the groundwork as to what the government was about before they got into office. Therefore, they have struggled since, and particularly then they've made some decisions that nobody expected a Labour government to make. So to that extent, at least, the question is whether or not Sarwar can, as he said, persuade us to focus on the Scottish government. Now, and in a sense, therefore, one way of paraphrasing what both of them said, because they were both quite open, is that John Swinney basically said, my problem is my government. And Anas Sarwar was saying, I'm hoping to God that my problem is not my government. But both, and again, it's a realization, as I said right at the beginning, before the gentleman coming in, that the problem these days is being in government. Now, what is the problem that certainly you see at the moment, as far as Sarwar is concerned, is there is this recent data polling done by YouGov. I think they did it again more recently, in which they ask people how much do you trust the UK government to handle the economy, and how much do you trust the UK government to handle health, and they ask the same questions about the SNP. Now, the truth is, one, in both cases, the numbers for the public as a whole in Scotland are negative for both of them. Okay. Right? So that's their problem number one. They're both of them relatively unpopular amongst the electorate. But the second thing, however, which is the difference, is that at least those people who voted SNP last year, which of course is a much diminished number of people as compared with 2021 or 2019. But at least the folk who were still voting the SNP last year give the SNP a positive rating on these criteria. Labour's problem is that even the folk who voted Labour in Scotland last year don't give the UK government a positive rating on these criteria. And that's one of the reasons, therefore, why, put not too fine a point on it, and you're going to realise how difficult the situation Alan Sarwar finds themselves in. Support for the Labour Party in Scotland has halved in 12 months. It's running on average at 18%. It was at 35% last year. So that's the problem he faces. Now, I think we then learned one thing, and I'll let you quiz me. I think there was an interesting conversation towards the end with Alan Sarwar about what happened in 2011. And there is no doubt that in 2011, the reason why the SNP got an overall majority is because about 40% of people who at that stage believed in the union were willing to vote for the SNP, and it was because the perception of the SNP could stand up for Scotland, and that fateful encounter with a well-known left-wing activist in Glasgow Central Station, which ended up with the Labour leader going inside the front of a submarine shop and out the back. And the point was, this was the man who was going to stand up to David Cameron, and everything collapsed. But the political world we're in is now different. So if you go back to 2021, okay, basically that was an election like politics in Northern Ireland. Okay. Around 85 to 90% of people at that election who said they believed in independence voted for the SNP, and less than 10% of people who said they would vote no voted for the SNP. So we really became completely divided around the constitutional question. And at the time when the SNP were having that debate 2 or 3 years ago about should we try and persuade the public that the next election should be about independence, I was going, the public are already there. You're behind them. That's what the public are doing. Now, what has happened since is on the independence side, Sarwar is right. The Labour Party has had at least some success in persuading people who still say they vote yes to vote for them. The SNP have only got about 2/3 of yes voters saying to vote for them. But just in case you think the constitutional question doesn't matter, on the other side, amongst unionists, there are still virtually nobody now who is willing to vote for the SNP. Right. And the constitutional, so the folk who really worry about, are concerned about the constitutional question at the moment, it's not the independence folk, it's the unionist folk. They are the ones who are not willing to cross the divide. So, and to that extent, therefore, it's clear that the only way that Swinney is going to get his numbers up is to try to persuade the folk who still believe in independence, and that number has not come down during the course of the last 2 years, is to try to get some of them back to voting for the SNP, and that in part, I think, is trying to get to sell the case for independence. And we should understand that the argument about independence is fundamentally different from what it was in 2014. It's no longer a question of, do you want to be inside or outside the UK? It's whether you want to be inside the UK but outside the European Union, or inside the European Union but outside the UK. And that intellectually is a very, very different question with all sorts of different kinds of trade-offs. The SNP so far have not succeeded in getting that debate started. I think that was the big failure of Nicola Sturgeon's last 6 months as First Minister. The question is, does John Swinney, A, have the ability to get that heather bit of heather lit, and that historically has not tended to be his forte. He's got many, many valuable political qualities, but he A, needs to do that, and B, he also does indeed need to persuade those potential supporters that actually the SNP's record of government could trust it. Because the interesting thing was that until Nicola Sturgeon resigned, there were plenty of people in Scotland who were critical of the SNP's record. There were plenty of people who voted for the SNP who were critical of the record. It didn't make any difference because the constitutional question dominated. The problem the SNP have now is that their record of government does matter.
So that's exactly what I was just about to say, though. But however, it's still different from Westminster, right? Because if you go back this time last year, the Tories were so unpopular. The Starmer really didn't. This is how the whole Ming
Well, if I may say so, Andy, very, very gently, the Tories are even more unpopular now than they were 12 months ago.
Well, you don't have to be gentle with me on that one. But Starmer didn't have to really do anything to win, is my point.
But there's a striking similarity here. Now, the reason why Starmer didn't have to do much to win is because Nigel Farage did the work for him, right? The dirty secret of Labour's 174 majority, that a fundamental foundation is that Reform took 1 in 4 of those folk who voted Conservative in 2019. That got them to 15%, and Reform at 15% meant that they pushed the Conservative vote down such that a Labour vote that was barely rising, although it was benefiting from tactical voting in the constituencies where they were starting off second to the Tories, the Labour Party didn't do very much to win, right, in order to be able to pick up all these constituencies. But essentially it's Reform that laid the ground. The reason why at the moment Reform is good news for John Swinney is that what Reform are picking up virtually nobody from the SNP. There's about 2% of people who voted the SNP last year who are going to Reform. Reform are fragmenting the unionist vote. And as a result, therefore, the SNP, who now at about 33%, are barely any more popular than they were last year, but now find themselves, instead of 5 points behind one of the unionist parties and therefore losing head over heels, they now find themselves 14 points ahead of their nearest competitor, and that's a race between Labour and Reform. And because so much of Holyrood's electoral seats are elected by first past the post, because the SNP's vote is geographically evenly spread, then that is likely to result in a relatively large number of the constituencies going to the SNP, such that we might even still end up with a pro-independence majority. It will be a heavily disproportional outcome, despite the fact that we have a proportional system.
Let's just head out into the audience who are with us here at Johnny Walker, and friend of the pod, Kat Headley is here. Hello, Kat. Lovely to see you.
There's been a lot of reflection tonight, and I think that Andy actually kind of came round to it when he was speaking to Anas, that you were almost rushing out the room when you would actually talk about devolution, by the point. And it took quite a long time, and I obviously have a bias in this, I'm not going to deny it, to get to Swinney in 18 years of an SNP record. It took 5 minutes to get to a 1-year Labour Party government record. And that is, I think, reflects the overall kind of the nature of the discourse in Scottish politics. Is there anything, John, do you believe that can, Anas believes that can change in the next year when people switch their focus? Do you believe that can happen? What will it take? Does it take actually the media, the commentators, to actually be marshalling that narrative? Or does it? Or is that wishful thinking?
So hang on. What's your complaint that the people aren't being sufficiently critical of the SNP's record in government?
Well, there's an unhappiness with the SNP government record, and that there's an unhappiness with the Labour Party government record. But when you're comparing 18 years and 1 year, that doesn't really feel like a fair. That they're not equal. That is not an equal kind of comparison to be making. Would be my point, and I think quite a lot of people's point.
So are you trying to argue that we should only be judging the 18 years of SNP government and not judging the 1 year of UK government?
I feel that you should judge the SNP 18 years more than you should be judging less than 1 year of a Labour Party government, which had 14 years of a Conservative government to try and undo.
Yeah, but look, I mean. I'm not in the game of saying that the electorate are wrong. The electorate have come to the conclusion that they have lost confidence in the current UK government rather quickly. Okay, and that's happened on both sides of the border. Now we can debate whether they're right or wrong to do that.
But that wasn't my
But that's
question.
what they've done. No.
So I think your question is around whether Sarwar's getting a raw deal because there's a year that he's not judged on versus 18 years that the SNP should be judged.
It's actually more-
Anna Sarwar is getting a raw deal. The thing that most went wrong for Anna Sarwar in the last 12 months is Keir Starmer won the election.
Geoff?
It was always going to be difficult for Labour fighting there was all this confidence about Labour going to become the next government, etc., etc. Unfortunately, there are two crucial things here. Unfortunately, first of all, winning an election in the midterm of a UK government is going to be difficult. The second thing is this, and this comes to a fundamental structural difference. The truth is that even at the moment, despite the fact that the SNP have only got about 65% of the US vote behind them, they still have the crucial advantage that they are able to marshal more of their side of the constitutional argument than any individual party is able to do on the unionist side. So there are lots of people out there saying they're going to vote for unionist parties, but they can't agree on which one they're going to vote for, right? And the thing that Reform have done, because Reform are taking their votes virtually entirely from unionist parties, primarily from the Conservatives, but actually Labour are more vulnerable to Reform north of the border than they are south of the border. But basically what this has done, it's fragmented the unionist vote. So, I mean, the folk in Scotland are no happier with the SNP now than they were last year, and they're not any happier than they were the year before. But it's around a third of people in Scotland who are still willing to vote for them. And what was last year a losing position is now potentially a winning position, not because of anything they have done, but because of what's happened on the unionist side of the argument. So Labour's problem at the end of the day is, in a sense, they're not going to win this election by being able to try and get folk off the SNP. They probably maxed that out last year, right? They could get back the people that had voted for them last year, fine, okay? If Labour are going to win this election, they have got to be able to get votes back from Reform, and they've got to ensure that those voters, if they go away from Reform, don't go back to the Tories. They've got to win the unionist vote, and that's where they're struggling.
I think hopefully, as I understood the question and just to give an example, so in March 2011, when we broke up for recess, there was a poll out that had Labour ahead of the SNP. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that? We broke into recess.
Oh, sure, there was movement during the campaign, absolutely.
And the campaign, and so I think...
I mean, rumour has it, Geoff, which I'm sure you'll deny, that the person who was most surprised to win was one A. Salmond.
He was rather surprised. Not to win, but to win as big as we did. Yeah, I mean, sure. I don't think we saw a majority. But I think, and I'm not sure if this is right, but within that campaign, people kind of changed the mindset from the UK election contest in 2010 to a Scottish contest. It wasn't all that happened. And I think the question is, and Anna's putting that forward. Yeah, am I right in saying that? Yes. Could that happen the next election?
But again, the world has moved on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the point is that until the 2014 independence referendum, there was always a significant difference between the levels of support for the parties for Westminster and for Holyrood. Right. So the SNP, until 2014, were always able to do better for Holyrood than they could for Westminster, and the opposite was true for Labour. And in a sense, it was about, when people were voting for Westminster, they were talking about which would be best for the UK as a whole, and when they were voting for the Scottish election, it was best for Scotland. And the Scottish Socialities data showed that. The independence referendum, because it made the constitutional issue so central, ended that because, of course, in 2015, the folk who voted for independence in 2014 were so keen to repeat what they had voted that they went off and voted for the SNP. Right? And therefore, and the truth is that since then, although most recently there's been a wee bit of a gap between the two, but basically voters now tend to vote the same way in both contests. So to that extent, at least, therefore, it's become more difficult for the Labour Party to be... the Labour Party historically has wanted people to focus on Britain, right? Yep. But it's now very difficult for them to be able to escape the fact that people are judging them by the performance of the UK government.
But that's exactly the problem. It's that they can't escape things. I mean, I share your gripe, Kat, right? I think it is really frustrating that this is the lens through which we see politics, but it is. Because we've got the 6 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news and the Telegraph and the Mail and the Guardian and whatever else, and we inhale UK politics, and still, even after 25 years of devolution, we vote based on UK politics, irrespective of what election it is. And that is fundamentally the problem for all unionist parties in the Parliament, and that's fundamentally why an unpopular government keeps winning all the time. Because there's nobody else that they think they can vote for. Because, I mean, I know what Anas is saying, and Anas is, you know, I find him a very persuasive, very high-quality guy. Sure. And I think he can get in front of people, and I think he can change minds. The difficulty is, when you go to the ballot box in May next year, and you see the word Labour, you don't think Anas Sarwar, you're going to think Keir Starmer. You just are. That's what people are going to do. And I just don't think there's nothing that can be done about that issue.
If you're looking for comfort, Kat, Andy's made 2 predictions on the show and he's got them both wrong. So you may...
What was the other one?
I can't remember, but you did it.
We lose track. Can I ask, I'm really keen to hear if what you liked from either leader. Did you hear something that stood out? What's sticking out in your brain just now as something that was good, a positive thing, something that gives you hope, perhaps? Have a little think about that. Stick your hand up. We'll get a microphone to you because it'd be lovely to hear from you in the few minutes that we've got left. John, I wanted to ask you another couple of questions just about what we heard from Swinney and Sarwar. We've talked about the independence question. We've talked about the kind of pessimistic electorate. I do wonder who, out of the two of them, is going to who is more at risk from Nigel Farage. We've touched on this. Yeah. Is he the most persuasive of the 3 of them, actually? Yeah. If there were to be the 3 of them in a line, say, for example, in a debate, is it Nigel Farage that goes into that as the front runner in some ways?
I mean, whatever you think about reform, you have to understand that Nigel Farage is the most effective political leader we've got in the UK at the moment. I mean, my view is, I mean, let's just stick to UK politics at the moment. My view is that we've had a rather poor set of politicians. So what's my criterion here? My criterion here is, 1, a degree of charisma, but B, an ability to craft and sell a synoptic message and a vision. Okay, where do you want to go? You know, this is, as we referred to earlier, this is Starmer's fundamental problem. He does not articulate a vision of the kind of country he wants to create. He's coming. The way in which I articulate it sometimes to say is that basically what Keir Starmer said: "Hello, I am your nice plumber who is going to repair the damage that's been done to you by that nasty Jack Frost called the Tories," all right? But of course, what voters are looking for is not a plumber who's, frankly, he keeps on coming back and he keeps on coming back and there's another leak and it doesn't seem to be quite sorted. What the voters are looking for is an architect that's going to build them a new house. And Starmer's not an architect. Rishi Sunak, the last 12 months of his government, they pulled every possible lever they could pull to try and see if he could move the electorate. But the problem was that the whole was less than the sum of the parts. There was no broad synoptic message. Now, I mean, I think the truth here, I think, again, this is, by implication, I think Sarwar needs to think about, well, you know, is saying we can do better than the SNP going to be enough to be able to excite the electorate? But equally, I mean, with John Swinney, one has to say, well, on the one, I mean, John Swinney's real craft as a politician is to be able to go on to GMS when you're in political trouble.
Good Morning Scotland.
Good Morning Scotland.
Yeah.
And to be able to field a difficult subject with highly articulate, extremely clear, extremely well crafted, and to say absolutely nothing of substance at all, which of course is a brilliant quality in a deputy. But the problem is now he's leader, and the question is, can he now begin to be able to actually give people the sense that there's a sense of direction, and therefore can he independence. Now, I mean, I think the truth is, for those of us who remember John Swinney Mark I as leader, he is much more comfortable in his own skin now. He was quite relaxed here this evening, but the point is, it's not relaxed what does it. I mean, it's coming back to what you were saying earlier. You know, Salmond was able to project a vision and had the personality to do it. And Sturgeon equally also was able to do this. The problem is we do have a lot of politics, and Farage can do it. And Farage, above all, the real secret about Farage is that Farage is absolutely brilliant at articulating the concerns of at least a particular section of our society. And it's the socially conservative pro-Brexit end of our society. He's absolutely brilliant at it in a way that none of our politicians can match.
Couple of thoughts to conclude our podcast special this evening. Andy, I want to come to you on what stood out for you. Swinney and/or Anna Sarwar, what is it that you're going away with tonight with 11 months to go?
I mean, I thought there were some interesting moments where you could see that there might be changes of direction, but everything is very subtle. Any changes of direction that you can identify are very subtle. And I asked John Swinney about the programme for government and the inherent safety in it, and the fact that it wasn't, we've got very deep structural problems in lots and lots of areas of policy and public life in Scotland. Actually, there's not really anything being done about it. There's not really much incentive to do anything about it, because ultimately, all the things that John has just said about the problems the SNP have got and the fact that John Swinney needs to articulate something that's more hopeful and more optimistic, even if he doesn't, and even according to John's extrapolation, he's still going to win anyway. He may not, as you say, he may not be as powerful.
But he won't win as well as he wants to.
But he's still going to be. He's still going to be First Minister.
Yeah,
so
sure.
The difficulty, I think, with Scottish politics at the moment is the way that we have structured it, the way that everybody has structured it. There is simply not sufficient incentive to be better. That's the problem. There's not enough incentive to be better. And there's not enough reward for being better, because somebody like an Sarwar can be as good as imaginable, but there are still structural barriers that he can't get over.
Geoff, John Swinney has been an MSP for any number of years. This is the first time he will be tested by the electorate as a First Minister, as a candidate in that way for First Minister, which adds a level of intrigue, doesn't it, to his favourability, his likeability, and indeed his vision.
Not as intriguing as that episode a week ago that we did, and we're all still wearing the same clothes a week on. It's quite bad. I think the biggest thing for me, for John, was, and John just touched on it there as well, in January, me and him got into a bit of a set too. And
on this podcast.
On this podcast,
yeah.
For those who didn't watch it. And I don't think I was particularly challenging, but he wasn't particularly happy about it. And I thought, okay, that wasn't Jeremy Paxman here, it was me. And I don't classify myself as a forensic journalist. Tonight, I gave him a little bit of a, just to get his engine going and see what would happen, and he was a lot more relaxed. I think that's a really important quality to have when you go into the teeth of a campaign, incidentally, if you can engage in that. I thought Anna Sarwar has grown in stature, even in that 4 or 5 months we're on. He's a much more comfortable, natural personality. But fundamentally, and I agree with Andy, this will be won and lost on who's looking after my interests. And in a Scottish contest, who's going to stand up for my interests? And I don't think either of them have got a compelling vision just quite yet. And I do worry that that might open the door for reform in the back door.
Geoff Aberdein, Andy Maciver, and Professor Sir John Curtice, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all so much for joining us at Johnny Walker Princes Street for the first of our Election 2026 specials. Please make sure you have subscribed to the podcast on your podcast app, or indeed on YouTube, where you can watch every episode in wonderful high definition. Oh, what a treat. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night. Thanks for taking part, and we will talk to you again soon.